Darkness hummed inside the cryo chamber like a forgotten lullaby. The lights, what remained of them, flickered in long, hesitant blinks, pale and sickly across rows of frosted pods. Some still emitted a dim, rhythmic pulse indicating life. Others glowed steadily, coldly. Silent tombs were frozen. Ira Jensen stirred alone, trembling as a hypersleep gel sloughed from her skin. The cold gnawed at her muscles, her lungs drawing breath in shallow gasps, shocked by the sharp, sterile air. She collapsed to the grated floor, naked, slick, shaking. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the dim illumination, the quiet clicks and groans of failing support system echoing to the chamber like whispers of ghosts. No alarms, no voices, no movement. She forced herself up, grabbing a discarded thermal wrap from the emergency locker. It smelled faintly of ozone and something else, old copper and dust. The synthetic fibers scratched her raw skin, but she clung to the heat it offered. Her hands fumbled across the floor grating until they found the service panel. It buzzed weakly, enough to pull a diagnostic. The results crawled across the tiny screen in fractured red text. Ship status, critical. Cryo failure. Units 043 through 132. Passenger survival, 3%, 2.8%, 2.7%. She stopped reading. The chamber stank of ice burn and decay. A dozen pods nearest were fogged over, but she could make out shapes, some too still, too skeletal. Time had moved on without them. Frost clung to bones, embedded in ice sockets, wrapped around brittle fingers like snow on branches. Ira knelt by the nearest pod, its occupant clearly long dead, the skin hardened into ash-like flakes. She rested her hand against the cold glass, her reflection fractured in its surface. They were gone. All of them. Or most. The ship had been carrying a coalition crew, humans, of course, but also alien delegates, scholars, engineers from allied civilizations. A diplomatic voyage with a future in its wake. Hundreds of minds entrusted to hypersleep and to the sterile silence of space. Why had she woken? The cryo system shouldn't fail unless. Sabotage or catastrophic miscalculation. She moved down the row, breath fogging before her. Some aliens were encased in ice thicker than human pods. One bore crystalline limbs and gills. Another had a shell-like torso with frost branching across it like veins. Their pods still blinked, some fast, some fading. Ira felt her pulse quicken. Someone or something had interrupted their sleep cycle, but only she had emerged. The engineering deck was sealed. Power reserves hovered just above critical. Life support would hold another 30 hours. Maybe 40 if she diverted everything to the cryo chamber. Food stores were locked in the lower modules, now frozen shut. So she made a choice. In the crew storage compartment, she found emergency kits. Flares, sealant patches, thread, multi-tools. A spool of carbon fiber filament caught her eye. Tough, light, and flexible. Not enough for repairs. But something about it held her gaze. Her hands moved instinctively. Years ago, in a cold childhood on Mars fringe colonies, she knitted to stay sane. Blankets, scarves, something to wrap around her when the wind screamed through the walls. Her fingers remembered what her mind didn't want to face. She unraveled synthetic padding from seat covers, insulation from wall panels, even delicate mesh from alien beds that mimic silk. The process became a rhythm. Gather, separate, stitch. Wrap, seal, test. She didn't know if warmth alone could save them, but it was the only thing she could offer. One pod blinked more brightly than the others. A human male. Crew, not diplomat. His face was pale but intact. Ice clung to his eyelashes. The pod's life signs flickered just above zero. She slipped the newly fashioned thermal wrap inside, careful not to jostle the sensors. The blanket pressed against his chest, slowly absorbing what little body heat remained. The next hours blurred. She moved from pod to pod, weaving, wrapping, watching. Her hands bled from cold and abrasion. Her breath rasped. Sometimes she whispered aloud, nonsense words, old songs, anything to fill the silence. No one answered, but it helped. The cold made her mind feel slow, but the act of creating gave her a thread to hold on to. She began to track time in loops, one blanket, took 1 hour. She had maybe 25 hours left. At hour 5, one of the aliens twitched. It was subtle, a flex of limb, a pulse in its pod. She didn't celebrate. Not yet, but she wrapped it again, reinforcing the corners, sealing the warmth. She lingered longer at that pod, watching, wishing. By hour 9, another blinked open, this one with large black eyes and translucent skin that shimmered like oil in moonlight. Its gaze didn't focus, but it moved, mouth opening to emit a faint clicking. It didn't speak her language. It didn't need to. It was alive. She cried then, just once, quietly, fiercely, then swallowed it back down. There was still work to do. At some point, she found the journal console. Voice to text. The old kind. She activated it, speaking between labored breaths. Log entry 1. Ira Jensen, engineering subcommander, woke from hypersleep at 0431 ship time. Cryo failure confirmed. No crew active. Power failing. Multiple species frozen. Attempting recovery using thermal insulation. She paused, fingers trembling, knitting blankets. Not sure why it's working, but it is. Maybe warmth reminds a body. Maybe it's just time. I don't know. I'll keep going until I can't. Another pod beeped. The man from earlier gasped and jolted within his chamber. Ira dropped the recorder and rushed to his side, fingers flying across the controls. The pod hissed open. Steam and frost spilled onto the floor. His eyes fluttered open, startled, bloodshot, alive. He stared at her. Don't speak, she said gently, pressing the blanket tighter around his frame. Just breathe. He obeyed, too weak to resist. She left him with a second blanket and moved to the next pod. The ship's hum was quieter now. The engines were nearly dead. But still, she worked. The lights flickered again, longer this time, the darkness holding just a few seconds more than before. But when they came back, she was still there, on her knees, threading warmth through silence, one stitch at a time. And far across the ship, deep within another corridor, something else stirred. A pod blinked awake. A set of alien eyes flickered open in the dark. It had felt the warmth. It remembered fire. Ira didn't know what came next, but the stitch held, and she kept knitting. Ira's hands were blistered now. The fine fiber she had torn from the alien mesh cut into her fingers like thread through parchment. But she didn't stop. Every motion had meaning. Each pulled a strand, each knot of material. The quiet in the cryo chamber had shifted. It was no longer the oppressive silence of death, but a waiting hush, like a breath held at the edge of hope. The man she'd woken, Tomas Ree, according to the name on his pod, had stabilized, though speech still eluded him. He sat cross-legged against the wall, pale and trembling beneath layers of her patchwork blankets. He watched her work with sunken eyes that slowly began to hold recognition. "You knit," he said finally, voice rough as sand. "You're actually knitting." She gave a tired smile, not looking up. "It's crude, but it works." Tomas let his head fall back against the cold wall. "Can't believe I woke up to this cold coffin and blankets. Would you rather I hadn't?" "No, just didn't think the mission would come down to thread and desperation." "Neither did I." The tension between them wasn't hostile. It was the kind born from shared shock, the aftermath of a disaster too vast to comprehend. They had both been officers, though in different sections. He had been communications. She barely remembered his voice from briefings. Now, in the flickering half-light of a dying ship, he was her only other heartbeat. Another pod blinked. She turned sharply, her hands instinctively reaching for her tools. This one belonged to a being unlike the others, smaller, with four delicate limbs curled like wire in a fetal posture. The life sign was steady but shallow. She hesitated. "Tomas, this one's not human." He pushed himself up, wincing. "Try anyway." She nodded. The blanket she fashioned this time was thinner, layered with the alien mesh from the sleeping chambers. It shimmered faintly, catching what little light remained. She wrapped it carefully around the pod's edge, the material absorbing residual heat and reflecting inward. The being stirred, a slow unfurling of motion, like a flower opening in time-lapse. Its skin was semi-translucent, with veins glowing faint blue. It didn't speak, but its eyes found Ira immediately, huge, dark, almost sorrowful. Ira held its gaze. "You're safe," she whispered. It didn't answer, but the way it drew the blanket close to its body was enough. Hours bled together. Ira stopped marking time, relying instead on instinct and the rhythms of exhaustion. Every time her hand stilled, her thoughts raced. What had caused a failure? Who had survived? Was help even a possibility? She dared not search the rest of the ship yet. The energy it would cost was too great, the risks too high. Here, in this chamber, she had control, thread, motion, warmth. 3 more beings awoke. One of them, a thick-skinned reptilian type with a heavy jaw and glowing chest, sputtered as its pod hissed open, body convulsive with the shock of reanimation. Ira and Tomas dragged it from a unit, wrapping it as quickly as they could. For a moment, it looked like it wouldn't stabilize. Then, with a wheezing breath, its lungs flared wide, and it lay still. The reptilian's eyes opened moments later and settled on them. It groaned, then flexed one large hand, holding the blanket up as though confused by its texture. "You're welcome," Ira muttered, wiping her brow. The alien rumbled something deep and guttural. Tomas raised a brow. "I think it might have just thanked you." Ira almost laughed. "That, or call me a lunatic. Could be both." She began to notice something subtle, but real. The ones who woke responded to blankets differently. It wasn't just about heat. There was something in the texture, the wrap, the human touch embedded in every loop and stitch. The act of making seemed to matter. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't calculated. It was care, a hand reaching through the void, a language even the cold couldn't erase. Her supply stash was dwindling. She unraveled the last wall padding, carefully extracting insulation from the chair mounts, sometimes stripping part of her own clothing. Her coat lost its lining. Her gloves became fingerless. Tomas tried to help, though he lacked the precision. Still, he was steady, and that mattered more. They didn't talk much. Words cost energy, but a rhythm formed between them, a quiet partnership of purpose. The translucent alien, whom Ira had started calling Whisper, remained close, watching everything. It didn't communicate in any conventional sense, but its presence was calming, its gaze intelligent. Occasionally, it mimicked Ira's motions with its long fingers, as though trying to understand. When Tomas finally managed a crude square of stitching, Whisper took it and placed it carefully over a sleeping pod, mimicking the way Ira had done. "Looks like we're teaching knitting now," Tomas said with a crooked grin. "We're teaching survival." That night, or what passed for night in deep space, the chamber grew warmer, only by a few degrees, but was enough to make Ira pause and blink in surprise. She checked the diagnostics. Life support was still low, but the pods she'd wrapped were emitting higher energy signatures. It was as if their recovering bodies were feeding heat back into the air. "Feedback loop," she whispered. "The blankets are keeping them warm long enough for their cores to reactivate, and they're warming the space in turn." Tomas looked over her shoulder. "That means, if we can revive enough of them, we might stabilize this section. Buy ourselves days instead of hours." They looked at each other, the weight of hope fragile between them. But not everyone was waking. Some pods were too far gone. Ice had encased the occupants entirely, their forms lost beneath thick crystal. One of them, a tall humanoid with long hair and curved horns, was frozen in a silent scream. Ira paused in front of it, pressing her palm to the glass. No pulse, no response, just the stillness of an unfinished life. "We won't get to everyone," Tomas said quietly behind her. "I know, and we can't stay here forever. I know that too." But she didn't move, not right away. They lost 3 more attempts over the next few hours. The blankets didn't help. The bodies didn't stir. Each failure was a little heavier than the last. Still, Ira kept going. It was Whisper who alerted her to something new. The alien pointed, a long, graceful arm stretched toward the back of the chamber. One of the pods was open, but Ira hadn't opened it. She rose quickly, Tomas close behind. The pod door hung ajar, steam curling from its edges. It was empty. Someone else woke up. Tomas said, scanning the chamber. No, Ira whispered. Something else. And then she saw it. Just a flash, a shadow between the far rows. Movement. A figure slipping between the bodies. Not human. Not one revived. Her heart kicked. Another survivor? Tomas asked. Ira didn't answer. Her instincts screamed something different, but there was no time to dwell on it. The cryo chamber groaned. Another life pod blinking red. Another chance to save someone. Another stitch in the thread of survival. Whatever that shadow was, it would have to wait. Ira turned back to her station, picked up her needle, and began to knit again. The temperature had risen 2 degrees. It wasn't much, but in the tomb of steel and silence, it felt like a victory. Frost on the far walls began to weep, droplets trailing down like tears from the ship's exhausted skin. Ira could feel her breath now, not just as a cloud in the cold, but in her lungs. Easier, deeper. Her limbs still ached from cold, but her fingers moved faster, her mind sharper. The warmth meant time, and time meant more lives to save. But the shadow hadn't returned. Not a sound, not a trace. Tomas had rigged a basic motion detector from a salvage console and fixed it to the corridor just outside the cryo bay. It flickered occasionally, never enough to confirm anything, but enough to gnaw at their nerves. Something was awake on the ship, and it wasn't one of them. I checked every pod log, Tomas said quietly, sitting beside her as she wove another blanket, this one for a juvenile creature whose limbs had begun twitching. Only 42 life signs ever registered on this deck. We've revived 12. 5 failed. 2 unaccounted for. Ira glanced up, and one of them is out there. Tomas nodded, but it didn't try to contact us. Didn't respond to the warmth. It opened its pod and slipped away like it was hiding. Or hunting. The word sat between them, sour. Whisper was watching them again. Crouched at the edge of the warm circle with its strange, angled limbs wrapped in the first blanket Ira had made for it. Its head tilted when Tomas spoke. It mimicked the word softly, hunting. Its voice was like wind through reeds. Ira hesitated. Not you, she said quickly. Someone else. Whisper didn't seem afraid, but it stood and drifted to the edge of the chamber, eyes glowing faintly. It looked toward the corridor, long fingers splayed against the bulkhead. Then it looked back at Ira and said a single word. Danger! The motion sensor went dark an hour later. Not tripped, not triggered, just dead. Tomas swore under his breath, yanking the casing open and digging into the wires. It's not damage. Something fried the sensor, remotely. That shouldn't be possible. Not without command-level access. Maybe it found a way. Then it's learning. Ira didn't speak. Her hands continued weaving, but her ears strained for any sound beyond the usual hum and breath of the room. She couldn't afford panic. She couldn't even afford distraction. A soft clang echoed from the corridor. Tomas straightened. You heard that? She nodded. He moved to the door and activated the emergency seal. A low hiss confirmed the lockdown as reinforced plates slid into place. But Ira knew it was just theater. If the thing had already bypassed systems, it would find a way in. We'll need to rotate shifts, she said finally. Sleep in turns. Work in turns. No one's alone. Tomas nodded. I'll take first watch. She didn't argue. Her body ached for sleep, but her mind wouldn't stop replaying the sound of the pod opening unprompted. The image of the empty bed. When she finally closed her eyes, Whisper sat beside her, silent and still. She dreamed of unraveling. Not her body, but the threads, the blankets, the hope itself. The yarn she'd woven became ash in her hands, drifting away in zero gravity. And in the dark, something watched. Not with eyes, with hunger. She woke with a jolt, Tomas shaking her gently. Ira, one of the juveniles. It's not breathing right. She scrambled up, crossing the room to where a small, bioluminescent being twitched and gasped inside its open pod. The blanket had slipped. Its skin was going pale blue, frost reappearing at the joints. Heat lamp, she ordered. We need more concentrated warmth. And another layer. They improvised a cocoon from what remained of Whisper's mesh, layering it around the small body while Tomas angled the salvage heat lamp closer. The creature shuddered violently, and then with a hissing exhale relaxed. Its limbs settled. Its core glowed faint green. "Got it," Tomas murmured. Ira leaned back against the nearest pod, eyes closing briefly. But then Tomas froze. "What?" He didn't answer. His gaze was fixed behind her. She turned slowly. At the far end of the cryo bay, something stood beyond the sealed door, a figure barely visible through the reinforced glass. Humanoid, tall, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its face too smooth. No eyes, just a pale stretch of skin where features should be. It tilted its head as if listening, and then it moved, not away, up. It crawled up the wall like it defied gravity, limbs clinging to metal, head swiveling unnaturally as it disappeared from view. Ira's stomach turned. Tomas was already running diagnostics, scanning for access points. "It's in the vent system. We need to keep it out of here. There's no guarantee we can. If it gets into the wiring, it's already in the wiring." Whisper stepped forward, looking up where the creature had vanished. Then it looked at Ira. "Bad thing. You know it." Whisper's eyes dimmed. "Made with us. But not us. Broken." The implications landed like a cold blade. "You're saying it was part of your group?" Whisper nodded once. "Too long and cold. Mind unraveled. It forgets the warm. Only wants stillness. A predator." Whisper didn't answer. Tomas moved to the terminal, fingers flying. "I'm going to try redirecting power from non-essential decks. Create a lure, heat pockets that might draw it off." Ira handed him one of the small battery cells. "Be careful. If you overload anything, we could trigger a decompression." He gave her a sharp look. "We're past playing safe." They set the decoys, 4 heat pockets scattered in surrounding corridors, each one rigged with low-power emitters, enough to mimic body warmth, enough to possibly distract. Then they waited. The thing didn't take the bait. Instead, the vents hissed open above Pod 19, the one housing the last adult of Whisper species. It hadn't stirred in hours, still trapped in a coma-like state. The creature descended like mist, limbs barely making sound as it crept toward the pod. Ira ran. She didn't think, didn't scream. She launched herself across the room, grabbing the insulated rod they'd used to stir vent systems, swinging it with both hands. The impact knocked the creature sideways. It hit the ground with an awful skittering screech, limbs splaying out like broken joints. It didn't bleed, but it moved fast. Tomas grabbed the emergency foam gun, firing a burst that coated its back. It hissed, flailing, scraping at the foam as if it burned. The cryo bay echoed with the sound of claws and rage. Then Whisper stepped between them. The alien raised its thin arms and spoke, not in words, but in a warbling frequency, sharp and strange. The creature paused, its head tilted, limbs freezing in midair. Whisper stepped closer. "Go," it said to Ira. "What are you doing?" "Memory. I will remind." Whisper, but Tomas pulled her back. "We have to trust it." The last thing Ira saw before the door closed was Whisper placing its hand gently on the creature's face. Then the lights flickered, and the bay went still. Silence pressed against the cryo bay like a second skin, heavy and immovable. Ira stood at the sealed doorway, hands clenched against the reinforced panel, eyes locked on the stillness beyond. No movement, no sound, just the soft, pulsing lights of the pods and the gentle hum of emergency life support. Whisper had not returned. Tomas paced beside her, one hand running through his hair. "It's been 7 minutes. Feels like hours. I don't know if we did the right thing." Ira didn't respond. She didn't know either. All she could do was wait, the sting of uncertainty crawling under her skin. The creature, whatever it had once been, was beyond saving. That was what instinct told her. But Whisper had believed otherwise. And belief, in this fractured sliver of the universe, was rarer than oxygen. Another minute passed. Then, the door's control panel lit green. The lock disengaged at a hiss, and slowly, the bulkhead parted. Whisper stood in the center of the bay, The creature slumped motionless at its feet. The foam Tomas had sprayed still clung to its back in hardened streaks, but its limbs were folded neatly beneath its body. It didn't stir,